I wanted to start this talk here in beautiful Marin County, California, by introducing you to the single most sought-after demographic in modern cannabis. Now, this one person, or persona as we call it in public relations, is the one who's being marketed to by every single brand in California and beyond. And as I said, I wanted to introduce you to her, but it turns out you actually already know her because we, the cannabis industry, call her the Marin Mom. And you know what? The Marin Mom, she's up here working hard in Marin County, of course. She's taking care of her kids. She's driving 80% of her family's household spending. And every day, as my colleagues and I strategize on positioning our clients in the marijuana and CBD interest industries in front of the biggest decision makers and canna-curious audiences out there, we ask ourselves, what's the Marin Mom reading? What informs her buying decisions? And why does she do what she does? All right, a little bit of audience interactivity here really quick. So I'm going to say a word. I want you to say that word back to me on a 3 count. So, of course, the word is marijuana. 1, 2, 3, marijuana. Okay, one more time. 1, 2, 3, marijuana. Much better. What does that make you think of? Because to me, I used to think of Amsterdam and High Times Magazine, but now it's 2019. I'm thinking about Marin County. I'm thinking about Bon Appetit. Because legalization is the most significant drug policy shift of our lifetimes, and it's bringing on unexpected challenges and opportunities that affect us all, even if you don't consume. Speaking of demographics, I'm a lifelong journalist, and after 20 plus years working at daily newspapers, I decided to get into public relations, and now I own my own agency based out of Denver. I flew from Denver to San Francisco yesterday, and it's funny, San Francisco and Denver were both cannabis capitals. We've witnessed everything from prohibition to legalization. And in many ways, you can't tell this story without at least acknowledging, of course, Reefer Madness, which was such a successful propaganda campaign that really changed the game here and across the entire world. For 80 years, they told us that marijuana would make addicts out of our children. And they also told us, linking us with warnings that marijuana was going to lead to murder. It would lead to rape. And it would lead to one of the biggest crime waves you've ever seen, according to Nancy Grace. But as you know, none of that has actually happened in the regulated legal markets that now dominate most of North America. So what are the actual unintended consequences of legal cannabis? Let's talk about a couple of them as they relate to ourselves, our kids, and future generations. Starting with ourselves, because let's be real and honest, some of us in this room consume legal cannabis, right? Give me some raised hands. All right, I see you. And some of us don't, and that's okay. And we all coexist together, at work, at home, on the roads and highways. But you know what's terrifying? If I were to give a drug test right now to every single person in this theater, which mind you, I'm not, I wouldn't do that to you, but if I were, there is no actual way that we could tell how high any of you are right now. It sounds like a stoner joke, a bad stoner joke, but it's not. And for a variety of reasons, primarily because cannabis is fat-soluble, modern medicine and modern science have not yet figured out a way to accurately determine THC intoxication. Not from blood tests, urine tests, saliva tests, or even breathalyzers. And so police looking to detect weed DUIs are mostly relying on field sobriety tests like, "Sir, can you touch your nose?" But meanwhile, everyone agrees that the blood test used to determine, quote, stoned driving in most legal states has absolutely no scientific merit. And this comes from law enforcement. This comes from the medical community. It's scary because that means you can get a DUI when you're actually not under the influence. And even worse, you can actually get fired from your job for the same reason, regardless of your level of actual intoxication. And yet, cannabis is kind of legal here, right? Kind of? All right, so moving on to the next, and I have a question for you, because what about the kids? If you've been paying attention from Just Say No to This Is Your Brain on Drugs, you know that cannabis will kill an entire generation of youths, right? That's what we've been told. Because the prohibitionists' battle cry for decades has been, what about the kids? And they would ask this as they hypothesized that teen use would skyrocket as cannabis became suddenly more available. Back in the pre-legalization days, not that long ago, we just didn't know the answer to this question. And so lawmakers, they wrote strict laws learning from underage purchases at liquor stores and designated cannabis dispensaries as age-restricted environments. Regulators wrote careful rules about advertising, all but promising that we would learn the lessons from Joe Camel and more recently Juul, and ideally make cannabis a more responsible industry than our tobacco predecessors. And everybody, these law enforcement and regulators and even the cannabis industry, has come together given the research that cannabis use is not great for the developing brain. And so we are encouraging these teenagers to not consume until they're 21 or 25. Now we are 6 years almost into the regulated adult use market. And the single biggest gift that we have based on this timing is the public health data that we've wanted for so long and the answers to some of these questions. And so this public health data, which is coming from multiple state health departments in addition to the federal government, it all shows that teen marijuana use is not increasing after legalization. It's level in many of these states, and it's actually decreasing in others, which is just fantastic news. And this real-world data is actually forcing the prohibitionists to change their narratives. And that's everything that we've been asking for, is to have a fact-based conversation. So what about the kids? If you ask me about the kids, and granted, it is still early, we need at least 10, 15 years to have a better idea, but based on 5 years of state and federal public health data, I'll quote my friend Roger Daltrey and say the kids are all right. So maybe we should channel some of that thought, some of that energy into exploring this plant's untapped potential. And let's start with these 3 important facts that I want all of you to know, because we have barely scratched the surface in terms of researching the marijuana and the hemp plants. There is infinitely more that we don't know than what we do know. That said, the world's most respected medical journals, as well as scientific organizations, are in absolute agreement that marijuana and its derivatives are legitimate, efficacious medicine, especially for those suffering from chronic pain, severe nausea, epilepsy, and other conditions. And lastly, it is impossible to overdose on cannabis, and it is significantly less addictive than opioids. And so, as I look to these future generations, I'll focus on the research happening right now, because this research, we don't know what it's going to tell us, but there are early indications that it's encouraging. And this research, like it or not, is another one of these unintended consequences of legalizing this plant medicine. and I promise it will transform lives in the years to come. I do want to start with PTSD, which affects more than 25 million Americans and has been described as, quote, watching a scary movie and you're on edge the entire time, except that's your life. Every day, every hour, you're literally afraid of everything. It sounds so awful, and what if cannabis can help with that? What about spasticity, which also affects millions of Americans, including so many people suffering from cerebral palsy, ALS, and multiple sclerosis? And one MS patient recently recalled he described spasticity as feeling like, quote, a steel rod running up my hamstrings. What if cannabis can help with that? And what about inflammation, which affects 1 out of every 5 Americans? No, cannabis will not cure these chronic inflammatory diseases that kill so many, but what if it can help? What if it can be part of the solution and improve one's quality of life at a time when they really need it? It helps that marijuana is already a proven anti-inflammatory, and we're learning more every year. So, of course, there are some negative and even harmful consequences of legal weed, including the industry's unsustainable energy consumption and some individuals developing dependence on and addiction to marijuana. But when we think about the biggest change for our communities that legalization has made here in the Bay Area, back in my home state of Colorado, I would very much encourage you to look around. What do you see? Because I think if you give it a hard look, you'll agree with me that the single biggest outcome of legalization is that these doomsday scenarios that have been predicted by the prohibitionists never, ever materialized. And that's huge when you think of it. Because think about everything we were told regarding cannabis legalization and how it was going to ruin these communities. It's interesting because it absolutely reminds me of one of my favorite childhood books, and that is The Monster at the End of This Book. And this is about Grover, our friend from Sesame Street, and he narrates this book, and he's terrified because he knows there's a monster at the end of this book, and he doesn't want you to turn the page. And so Grover is employing everything in his ability, from he's tying pages together with rope, he's nailing them together with a hammer and nails, he's building a brick wall. And of course, the reader and Grover get to the end of this book realizing that the monster is, of course, Grover. Now, 10, 20, 40 years ago, nobody knew what it would be like if we legalized adult use cannabis. That said, a vocal and powerful minority taught us and trained us to fear this plant. They trained us to fear this plant, and that said, the monster at the end of this book, which is about cannabis legalization and psilocybin decriminalization and progressive drug policy reform, the monster at the end of this book isn't only one segment of the populace. It's not just the prohibitionists. Really, it's all of us, because we are the monsters that project fear and prejudice onto the unknown. We are the monsters who are easily manipulated by misinformation stemming from authority. The prohibitionists were begging us not to turn the page on legal marijuana, and yet we did. And I would argue that it's one of the smartest things that we, the people, have done in a generation. Thank you very much.